Thank you. Set up. I am currently on retreat at a, monastic retreat center in St. Paul, Minnesota, as the start of my sabbatical. So I'm not in my normal environment for doing online presentations. So I will make do with what I can. Um, so my chapter, which is chapter 16 in the Oxford Handbook, is on online liturgies. It's something that, in a way, I kind of fell into. Prior to the pandemic, in the very early stages of the Global Network for Digital Theology, I was trying to find a way of taking the doctoral work I had done, my PhD is in liturgical studies, and the work that I ended up doing for a while, which was working with theological schools and seminaries in digital coursework, online learning, stuff I had kind of picked up during my doctoral work as a side gig or one of those things where you're never quite sure if you're ever going to get a tenure track professorship anywhere. So you should have some marketable skills beyond just doing the theological disciplines. Fortunately, I did get a tenure track faculty position. Actually, I've had two. But prior to the pandemic, trying to find a way to take my academic work and my administrative work and bring them together, and which is how I stumbled into the early iteration of the Global Network for Digital Theology. And then when 2020 came and we had the great social upheaval known as COVID, all of a sudden, the things I had been thinking about more theoretically, or at least just in kind of early iterations of online worship or online liturgies, became the way we did worship. And as congregations and worshipers were starting to go back into normal, whatever normal was considered, I worried that what we had experienced during the lockdowns and what we had experienced in these alternate forms of liturgical gathering would just dissipate from people's memories, and we would not necessarily reflect theologically on what happened or learn from what it meant to do worship online, even when we were back in on-site or in-person locations. And so that led me to do a lot of theological reflection on that. And then I was invited by Jonas and others to contribute to this volume. So I will provide a little bit of an overview of the essay. I don't want to give it all away because I want you to buy the book and have to read it. So that, I guess Oxford gets a lot of money out of it or whoever gets paid from this, but you should read it. They're all great essays. So the essay in there is really kind of in four major topics. There's the theological foundations of worship itself, which I thought was necessary to put forward before we talked about anything with online worship, assuming in a handbook that people who are reading are not all liturgical scholars. They don't have a working knowledge of liturgical theology or the history of worship. So you have to provide some of that foundational material looking at what had kind of come before Zoom, which is where we currently are, or other forms of online worship, what were the early attempts at intersections of technology and worship. The third, which is kind of the bulk of the essay, are the emerging issues. These are theological issues that came up for people that I would hear from people when they asked me questions, ones I experienced in doing online worship, and ones that continue to, at least in the circles of liturgical scholarship, be the big kind of debating points. And then, as we were asked to provide in these presentations, is some future perspectives or things we wish we had included in the essay but didn't get to. I, fortunately, have an article coming out in the journal Worship next month on the future of online worship, where I was able to actually put in the things in that article, which I wasn't able to necessarily put in the essay in the handbook because we had to have our handbook essays done a year ago. And certainly everything is exponentially growing. So I wanted to kind of begin by talking like what is liturgy? So this is online liturgies. So how do we unpack the word liturgies? And really there are three primary understandings of the word liturgy that tend to operate. Many who may know colloquially the liturgy, trying to translate the Greek liturgia, meaning liturgy as the work of the people. Lots of books. In fact, I think there are a couple of books that are called The Work of the People that are about liturgy, um, which really focuses on what it is that the people are doing in the liturgical action. So, what is the participation? How is community arranged? What sort of activity is going on? So, this is from the field of ritual studies. So, you got liturgy as the people's stuff, liturgy as the thing that's happening and the stuff you do it with. So this would be the texts, again, the rituals, the symbolic actions, the format, the structure, liturgy as it might appear on the page of a book. So there's the stuff of the liturgy. So you got the people, the stuff, and then the third use of the word liturgy is what God is doing. So the sense that liturgy is not necessarily the stuff that we're doing, but the stuff maybe we are participating in that God originates, the divine initiative, things that God revealing God's self to us through preaching, through the sacraments, through singing, through prayer, through those actions. And so these are three very different understandings of the word liturgy. So when talking about online liturgies, and you have to try to define each of those two words, online and liturgies, liturgies can be more complicated to define than online. Because what you assume liturgy is going to impact what you think online liturgies are. So that is our kind of one complex thing in the essay that having to wrestle with just multiple points of entry for people. The second comes from not just defining what liturgy is, but theologizing that liturgy or theologizing worship. What do we think actually happens amid the people gathering or the structured text or God revealing God's self to us? And I draw on a very I mean, it's more complicated than this, but a very simple framework provided by the late Ruth Duck in her book, Worship for the Whole People of God, which came out in a second edition right in the midst of the pandemic with an appendix on online worship material in the back. And she talks about the 5 R's of kind of liturgical theology. One thing, if you ever are around a lot of liturgical scholars, we'd like to just create lists of things that begin with the same letter. It's much easier for us when we're talking about things. And so for its Ruth's 5 R's, ritual, revelation, response, relationship, and rehearsal. And so, ritual understanding worship as the repeated actions that help shape the communal and spiritual identity of a group over a period of time, kind of the classic ritual studies definition of any sort of communal ritual. Certainly, we understand worship or liturgy to do that as well. Something about communal cohesion. Revelation, this is the sense that what happens in worship is God coming to us. God reveals God's self to us through the things that happen in worship. Third, the response is worship is primarily about our responding to God through praise and thanksgiving. Praise worship, which sometimes is considered a genre of liturgical practice, it almost is understood as redundant in that sense. Praise, worship go together. Relationship is the sense that worship is about God coming to us, our responding, and our relating to everyone. So, really, kind of a network among God, the worshiper, and the neighbor or the partner or of creation, however you want to frame that. and rehearsal, which Duck will say is the most challenging liturgical theology of worship, is that what happens in worship is we'd say is a foretaste of the feast to come, or envisioning what it means for the reign of God to exist now. Certain theological traditions and denominations will connect more strongly with one or a couple of these. I would argue that all five of these emphases appear somewhere in most theological traditions or denominations, but certainly for those of you who are in this webinar can probably hone in on one or two of these that if you think about, oh, that's what I do on Sunday at worship. That's what the main framework is. So again, trying to talk about online liturgies becomes challenging because everyone has a different understanding of what worship or liturgies is to begin with. In the essay, I don't even touch, I mean, I mention them, but I don't touch the issue of sacraments. Those are in different chapters because that adds a whole nother level of complexity to this that requires its own essay or two or three or 10 beyond just understanding liturgy in a general sense. One of the directions that I take in this, and I'll have to give thanks to Catherine Schmidt for this, is understanding digitality as a culture. So a lot of the work that happened and after the Second Vatican Council was on the idea of enculturation. So moving to the vernacular, using things of the culture as elements in the worship environment, whether that be the elements for the Eucharist, fabrics for vestments, the type of music that is sung, that some things should connect between what's going on in worship and the surrounding culture. And the great Filipino Catholic theologian Ansgar Chapungo was kind of the father of enculturation, and from the 80s onward, used by most liturgical scholars to understand this interaction between worship and culture. So, if we understand the digital environment or digitality as a culture, can we use a similar connection, like enculturation, between worship and the digital environment? So that's something that I propose. If we understand the digital environment or digitality as more than just a tool or instrument, but as a culture that shapes meaning and relationships and practices, then there can be more of a connection of worship being at home in the digital environment than worship as something that is just using PowerPoint and Zoom, like I'm doing right now, I guess. But actually something that is can be inherent in in being in the digital environment. It also means that if the digital environment, if the online environment is a culture, it is also where new approaches to liturgical practice can happen that may not have happened that may not have happened in the in-person or on-site environment. So thinking of the digitality as a culture allows us to create digital native or digital originated liturgical practices. It is also mindful that cultures have limitations. And so the digital environment has limitations when it comes to worship. Anyone who's tried to do communal singing online knows that that is still, I would say, one of our biggest challenges in terms of just the practical aspects of online worship is to try to get everyone to sing together where you can hear everyone singing with you without a very weird cacophony. There are approaches to singing that are easier to do, but it's still to do like a 17th century Lutheran German chorale in four-part harmony on Zoom simultaneously still is a challenge. begs the question of whether we should still be singing 17th century German Lutheran chorales in four-part harmony. That's a different essay for probably a different handbook. Understanding digitality as a culture also helps us get beyond the sense that we're just converting in-person or on-site practices into the online environment. And this was, I would say, a decade or so ago when I was doing a lot of work in online learning. This was one of the big hurdles I had to convince my colleagues to get over because they wanted to do exactly what they were doing in the classroom, the physical classroom. They wanted to do it in the learning management system online. And it's like, well, you can do something. Some things translate very easily from one environment to the other. Some things do not. Again, you have limitations in each environment, but you also have opportunities in each environment that the other environment may not allow you to have. I think there are, like in online learning, asynchronous learning, there's a lot of opportunities in that that is much harder to do when you're on site and you're confined to a 3 hour period inside a classroom building. So a lot of what I argue in the essay is if we understand this as an environment, as a culture, not as just a tool or an instrument, then that can open us up to opportunities rather than trying to do the same thing we've always done in worship. Worship can evolve just like it has evolved over the last 2 millennia. So in terms of enculturation, the dynamic equivalence, so this is all from Chipungo, dynamic equivalence allows us to take the meaning of one thing in one culture and try to find the equivalent thing of that meaning in another culture. The things that that meaning are attached to may not necessarily be the same, but the meanings are important. And so that positions like, what is the theological significance of this thing we do in person or on site? And how can that theological significance show up in a different way in the online environment? Creative assimilation is to take things that are at home in a particular culture or environment and repurpose them or re-understand them. Um, I mean, one of the challenges we have are with these devices when it comes to worship, our smartphones, where people are, glued to them, even in on-site worship. Is there a way for us to repurpose a cell phone to provide significance for the liturgical environment? And again, organic progression is that once you move to a new environment or a new culture, things are going to necessarily change. And that's just how humanity works. It progresses. So again, understanding using enculturation as the lens kind of gets us, I think, beyond some of the challenges we have when debating online liturgies. In I'm going to run through these a little kind of quickly, again, read the essay, but some of the theological issues that I raise, and I don't really answer them, but I provide directions for people to go. The biggest one when it comes to online liturgy is, are we embodied beings when we're in the online environment? I think most of the essays in the handbook touch on that question in some way. I mean, the question of community. Can you have community when you're not, quote unquote, embodied becomes a large issue. That's the same when it comes to online worship. So you have to deal with the question of what is embodiment. Does it mean everyone breathing the same air, potentially being able to physically touch everyone next to you? Um, does it mean simultaneity, where we're all in a live environment, even if we're not necessarily in the same physical space? So the concern is about what is embodiment. Is being online embodied? It's the real versus digital or real versus virtual question in another different way. It has implications for how we understand the incarnation. So if we claim from a Christological perspective that God became flesh, therefore somehow flesh has something to do with what it means to be Christian, is being online somehow disembodied and disfleshed or unfleshed? That's another question that's asked. In an essay that was in Studia Liturgica a couple years ago, talked about different forms of embodiment. And I thought that might be a way for us to approach this. Is there something we're so used to understanding embodiment as physical embodiment, fleshly embodiment. But if it's about bodies embodiment, certainly we are embodied when we're sitting in front of our computers looking at our webcams. I'm looking at all the little squares on my screen. You all look like bodies of some sort. I'm assuming you're sitting there embodied. I think it was Mary Hess, maybe 15 years ago in a book, said, the fact that I get a headache when sitting at my laptop for so many hours, hunched over, and get pain in my wrist, somehow should say that what I'm doing is embodied because my body hurts while I'm sitting here. So, thinking beyond the physical embodiment, the spiritual embodiment, social embodiment, any ways that bodies are present. And then understanding the embodiment online means that we may have to understand how bodies participate with one another differently if we're not in the same physical space. We're still participating, we're still engaging, we're still present. It's just not, we're not breathing the same air at the moment. Participation in community. Does online worship create problems towards participation? Is it passive observation or is it active engagement? And so the classic line from the Second Vatican Council in the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, full active conscious participation. That's in one of the early paragraphs of the Constitution as the response to the pre-Vatican II approach to the Mass, where worshipers were seen or understood by some as being passive recipients, but not necessarily engaged in the liturgical action. Certainly, the traditions of the Reformation back in the 16th century take on this question, and which is, the increase of communal singing, reception of communion more frequently, the priest turning and facing the people rather than having their back to the people, those types of things. I mean, there's a couple of challenges there. One, it assumes that if we're looking at it on a screen, somehow we're not actively engaged. That may be true. It may also be true if you're sitting in a pew in a church building. And we have centuries of people that they thought were not actively engaging. Two, it assumes active engagement or participation is a particular thing. Full active conscious, the three adjectives to participation in the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, has the assumption that everyone can somehow do most of what's going on, and they're fully there, and they're listening, and they're looking, they're using their senses. There's an inherent ableism attached to that. And there's also a default understanding of participation. That participation means active, that I can somehow gauge what it is. Rather than participation, listening is considered active participation in many studies, whereas in some liturgical scholarship, just listening isn't. You have to sing along. So I think online liturgies helps us to challenge some of the norms that have started creeping into even on-site worship in terms of what participation is. Community, a lot of liturgical environments have a hierarchical understanding. Online worship can flatten that, as online has tried to do, and participation understanding of network that goes beyond a limited space. Authenticity. Is what's happening online authentic? Is it real? And that goes back to an earlier question of like embodiment. What does it mean for it to be real? What is it going on? The question I would ask my students, What's the difference between online worship and an online Bible study? I mean, that'll take a whole class session to try to answer. But it's always like, what is it that makes it worship? That goes back to those things I was talking about earlier. And then how do you deal with things like space and time, objects, actions, texts, music, silence? Those are all challenges when it comes to the online environment that require intentionality. Again, not just trying to convert what you did in person to the online environment, but it requires to be intentional about being in the online environment. Polymodal,
Kyle, sorry,
yeah.
would it be possible to just noting the time?
Yes, I was
Um,
gonna,
yeah, fantastic.
yep.
We're I see you've got a lot of slides left, and
Oh, yes, I'm
we're
gonna,
now good.
so just to talk, and then I'll do the last slide here. What I didn't address in this essay, which I do in the article coming out next month, is some of the ethical concerns with online worship. So the use of AI, and Ricky Manalo, who was in this room for the previous session, his essay in the Proceedings on the North American Academy of Liturgy is very helpful, and I draw upon that in my essay. What does it mean to have AI generated material in online worship? And how do we ensure access? So, what is the responsibility of worshiping communities in trying to break down the digital divide that still happens in society around people not having access to participating in online worship? So, I will conclude with that.